So last time we left off with Beowulf boasting that he would defeat Grendel, that he was going to do it without weapons and armor, and that he was going to do it, um, because Hrothgar was doing him the favor of letting him kill the monster and thereby prove his, you know, skills to the world. Hrothgar was the one doing Beowulf a favor, not the other way around. Um, and when we ended up with a party that he was going off to. Well, in the party, this is just a recap of what you miss, because you see we're skipping. I think that was chapter 6, and now we're skipping to chapter 11. Some things happen. The most important thing that happens at the party that you just need to have a little basic knowledge of is that we meet the greatest warrior in Denmark. It's a guy named Unferth, whose name literally translates into unfaith, who has this devastating sword named Trunting, which is magic, and if it cuts you, the wound never closes. He also murdered his brothers to get the position that he's got, which makes him sort of like Cain, the guy who murdered Abel, and thereby connected to Grendel. And we got a little bit of that going on. He challenges Beowulf in sort of like this verbal battle, which Beowulf soundly wins. And it turns out that Unferth is a coward. He seems like he's brave because everybody's afraid of him, but he's not brave. He just causes fear, which is a lot like Grendel, at least to this point. Grendel causes fear in everybody who sees him. And the Watchman tried to cause fear in Beowulf by shaking a spear in his face. So we're establishing a pattern. And each time this pattern repeats, the enemy gets more intense. And so the feast goes on, and ultimately it ends. You find out during the feast that, like Beowulf's guys are pretty scared, and they've been drinking pretty heavily. And Beowulf, on the other hand, has only drunk what is required for hospitality. He shared like 1 cup of wine that was poured to him by the king's wife. And so he's still awake and ready to go. He's not full of fake courage. We established fake courage a couple of times here, this idea that people who want to be brave but aren't, they get drunk, and the alcohol gives them a sense of courage, which isn't true courage. True courage comes from the inside. It's not external. Again, true courage comes from the inside. It's not something you get by having a sword or armor or weapons. These are things that help make you feel courageous, even if you aren't. So Unferth, who has this devastating sword, he gets some of his courage from that sword, but it doesn't come from himself. Beowulf, who's willing to fight without a sword, shows a true courage that's inside of himself. He doesn't need a sword, he doesn't need armor, he doesn't need alcohol, he doesn't need outside aids to make him courageous. And that's something that I think the author is trying to communicate to the reader, to the audience, which would have been Anglo-Saxons of all ages. So, chapter 11, the battle with Grendel. We're going to have some classwork on this one at the end, so you want to pay attention through this one so that you can do the classwork. But here we go. Out from the marsh, from the foot of the misty hills and bogs, bearing God's hatred, Grendel came, hoping to kill anyone he could trap on this trip to high Herat. He moved quickly through the cloudy night, up from his swampland, sliding silently toward that gold-shining hall. He had visited Hrothgar's hall before, knew the way, but never before, nor after that night, found Herat defended so firmly, his reception so harsh. He journeyed, forever joyless, straight to the door. Then he snapped it open, tore its iron fasteners with a touch, and rushed angrily over the threshold. He strode quickly across the inlaid floor, snarling and fierce. His eyes gleamed in the darkness, burned with a gruesome light. Then he stopped, seeing the hall crowded with sleeping warriors, stuffed with rows of young soldiers resting together, and his heart laughed. He relished the sight, intending to tear the life from those bodies by morning. The monster's mind was hot with the thought of food and the feasting his belly would soon know. Pause. Okay, well, we get this is our best description of Grendel so far, and we can sort of picture him and what's going on. First off, it goes out of its way to tell us that he comes from the swamp, that he's a creature of the night. So he's from a place that's opposed to nature. He's from the dark, which is opposed to the light. And he comes up from the depths, from sort of this hell to this heaven, the bottom to the top, to cause damage in this hall. But we get a sense of his strength. He went straight to the door. The door is solid oak with iron fasteners, and he snaps it with a touch. He's like, boom. And the door's like, and just mulches the door. It turns into like fragments or whatever, tears it right off the wall. And then he strides across the inlaid floor, snarling in fear. So we get this wolf image of his snarl. his eyes gleamed in the darkness. You can imagine they just had a party with fires and it's sort of smoky in there, and his eyes are making like twin trails of red light across the smoke whirls. You know, then he stops seeing the whole crowd of his sleeping warriors and he laughs like because he's happy to eat them. He's looking forward to the feasting and the joy of killing and murdering. So he's pretty intense. But here's our foreshadowing, right? But fate that night intended Grendel to gnaw the broken bones of his last human supper. Human eyes were watching his evil steps, waiting to see his swift, hard claws. All right, so we get this very clearly that Grendel is not human, and human eyes are watching him. Well, we've established that the only Geat who's still awake is Beowulf, so the human eyes that are watching Grendel are those of Beowulf. Grendel snatched at the first Geat he came to, ripped him apart, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down, hands and feet. Death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. Whoa! Okay, Grendel's a badass. I mean, he comes to this Geat. Now, these are the 14 greatest warriors in all of Geatland. He picks him up. He rips him apart into two pieces, cut his body to bits with powerful jaws, drank the blood from his veins, and bolted him down, hands and feet. He even eats the hands and feet. Who eats human hands and feet? They're like fish tails. His hands and feet, and then it says death and Grendel's great teeth came together, snapping life shut. So, I mean, this is one of the greatest warriors in Geatland, and Grendel eats him like that. This establishes Grendel as a devastating fighter and really ups the tension for us in this story. But hold up, this is kind of disturbing on a couple of levels. First off, Beowulf is like the lord of these Geats, and you'd think he'd want to protect his men, and it establishes that he's watching, and he just lets Grendel eat this guy. I mean, why does he do that? I think there's a couple of reasons that we can consider and that are worth considering. Number one, maybe Beowulf's plan relies on surprise, which, I think it clearly does to some extent. And if that's the case, then he can't move or he loses the element of surprise. And so maybe it's a tactical decision. Number two, maybe he needs to scout out Grendel's abilities. And the best way to see what Grendel is capable of is to sacrifice one of his guys and let him get eaten. And I think that works as well. But to sacrifice one of his guys, I mean, shouldn't he be like defending his guys? That seems pretty harsh. It's a different world, it's a different culture. But third, and I think maybe this one is the most disturbing of the three options, is what if Grendel came through the door and Beowulf just got up and was like, "Yo, Grendel," and smashed him and destroyed him? Then Grendel wouldn't seem like all that. No big deal. It's kind of like if you play a team in football and you beat them, but they've never played anybody else. Everybody just assumes they're bad. Whereas if that team has a history of destroying people, and if you watch them play a good team and annihilate them, and then you beat them, it's a much different thing. So this is one of the greatest warriors in Geatland, and he just got trashed by Grendel. And this establishes Grendel as a great warrior, so that when Beowulf fights him, maybe Beowulf gets a little bit more fame. I think there's a lot of things to consider in this brief little episode. But whatever the case, Grendel is bad. He just chews this guy up and drinks his blood, and he's dead. All right. Then he stepped to another still body, clutched at Beowulf with his claws, grasped at a strong-hearted, wakeful sleeper, and was instantly seized himself, claws bent back as Beowulf leaned up on one arm. So now we get this, he's like, oh, now I'm going to kill this guy. He bends down to Beowulf, and Beowulf's all like up on one arm. He's like bending his arm backwards. That shepherd of evil, that's a kenning, of course. I think it's an interesting kenning because we think of shepherds as being associated with Jesus and the Lamb of God and the Good Shepherd and that sort of a thing, and calling him a shepherd of evil makes him sort of like the opposite. Anyway, that shepherd of evil, guardian of crime, knew at once that nowhere on earth had he met a man whose hands were harder. His mind was flooded with fear, but nothing could take his talons and himself from that tight, hard grip. Grendel's one thought was to run. from Beowulf, flee back to his marsh and hide there. This was a different Herat than the hall he had emptied, but Higlac's follower remembered his final boast and, standing erect, stopped the monster's flight, fastened those claws in his fists till they cracked, clutched Grendel closer. Pause. Well, this is an interesting turn of events. Grendel finds somebody who has the same strength as him. We've established they both have the strength of 30 men. And for the first time, somebody's fighting back against Grendel, and Grendel's first thought is to run. Grendel's a punk. He's a bully. He's used to people being scared of him, and as soon as he faces somebody who's not, he's like, "Oh God, I gotta run away." I think that's something that's coming out clearly here. Beowulf grabs his claws and crushes them in his fist till they crack. I mean, you can imagine he's got Grendel's hand and he's just squeezing it until like all the knuckles and all the bones in his hand break one by one. That's pretty gruesome. Clutched Grendel closer. The infamous killer fought for his freedom, wanting no flesh but retreat, desiring nothing but escape. His claws had been caught. He was trapped. That trip to Herat was a miserable journey for the writhing monster. The high hall rang. Its roof boards swayed, and the Danes shook with terror. Down the aisles the battle swept, angry and wild. Herat trembled, wonderfully built to withstand the blows, the struggling great bodies beating at its beautiful walls. Shaped and fastened with iron inside and out, artfully worked, the building stood firm. Its benches rattled, fell to the floor, gold-covered boards grating as Grendel and Beowulf battled across them. Hrothgar's wise men had fashioned Herat to stand forever. Only fire, they had planned, could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. Suddenly, the sounds changed. Actually, I'm going to pause there. We keep getting these little flashes. You can imagine the Danes, they're not in Herat. They're in their small buildings surrounding Herat, and they're hiding there. And they can hear the fight going on inside. And you get this image of them like in their sheets, like pulling them up over their heads and being like, no. And so I think there's that. But then we get this bit about Herat, like the two of them are fighting inside. Like Beowulf grabs Grendel and throws him across the room into the wall, and then Grendel smashes Beowulf through a table, and they're like battling across the hall, and the whole thing is shaking, and the fastenings and all this stuff are being put to the test by these great bodies battling inside. But there's this weird aside in here where it's like, only fire they had planned could shatter what such skill had put together, swallow in hot flames such splendor of ivory and iron and wood. This is something that is an illusion. Most of the Anglo-Saxon audience knows that Herat was a real place and that there was a civil war and that Herat burned down. And the civil war is coming. Like if you know your history of the legends of Denmark, what you'd know as an Anglo-Saxon reader is that King Hrothgar has these kids, but they're too young to become king, and he's super old. And so when he dies, instead of his kids becoming king, he's got this evil nephew, Hrothulf, and Hrothulf essentially makes himself, I guess, the what word do I want? Like the regent. There we go. That's the word. And he's, going to control the place until the kids come of age. Well, he does not give up power, and so the kids try and get the power they're supposed to have, and there's a civil war. And the greatest warrior on Hrothulf, the evil nephew's side, is Unferth, who fights on the wrong side. And ultimately, the war results in sort of the collapse of Denmark and the burning of Herat. And the hall goes up in flames, and this is a call out to that. So anybody who's listening knows sort of the history and what's coming. But let's get back to what really matters here. Let's see. The sounds changed. The Danes started in new terror, cowering in their beds as the terrible screams of the Almighty's enemy sang in the darkness, the horrible shrieks of pain and defeat, the tears torn out of Grendel's taut throat, Hell's captive caught in the arms of him who of all men on earth was the strongest. So the fight has been pretty intense up to this point, and all of a sudden the tone of Grendel's screams change. He goes from like, like being all angry to like being terrified. And that's almost more scary to the Danes than the sound of his anger. All right, let's see. I don't know why this has to be this way, but Here we are. That mighty protector of men, that's Beowulf, of course, meant to hold the monster till its life leaped out, knowing the fiend was no use to anyone in Denmark. All of Beowulf's band, oh, of course, you started to wonder probably at this point, like, what about those 14 Geats, 13 now? I guess that Geat number 1 died. But what about those other Geats? Are they even helping Beowulf? They are. But remember that Grendel is immune to damage from weapons. All of Beowulf's band had jumped from their beds, ancestral swords raised and ready, determined to protect their prince if they could. Their courage was great, but all wasted. They could hack at Grendel from every side, trying to open a path for his evil soul, but their points could not hurt him. The sharpest and hardest iron could not scratch at his skin, for that sin-stained demon had bewitched all men's weapons, laid spells that blunted every mortal man's blade. And yet, his time had come. His days were over. His death near. Down to hell he would go, swept groaning and helpless to the waiting hands of still worse fiends. Now he discovered, once the afflictor of men, tormentor of their days, what it meant to feud with Almighty God. Pause. It turns out, and this is, I think, one of the most interesting things of the story, that all of these great warriors that Beowulf brought with him are trying to help him fight Grendel, but they can't because their swords are useless against Grendel. And so what seemed like arrogance on Beowulf's part, like, I'm going to fight him hand to hand, actually turns out to be the only way to defeat Grendel. Grendel can't be defeated in any other way. And so, Beowulf picked because it was right, because it was honorable, but maybe because it seemed... Well, to some readers, it may seem arrogant or stupid, but it turns out to be the only way to handle him. And so it's working out for Beowulf, even though he couldn't possibly have known that. So where was I? Grendel saw that his strength was deserting him, his claws bound fast, Higelac's brave follower tearing at his hands. The monster's hatred rose higher, but his power had gone. He twisted in pain, and the bleeding sinews deep in his shoulder snapped. Muscle and bone split and broke. The battle was over. Beowulf had been granted new glory. Grendel escaped, but wounded as he was, could flee to his den, his miserable hole at the bottom of the marsh, only to die, to wait for the end of all his days. And after that bloody combat, the Danes laughed with delight. He who had come to them from across the sea, bold and strong-minded, had driven affliction off, purged Heorot clean. He was happy now with that night's fierce work. The Danes had been served as he'd boasted he'd serve them. A prince of Beowulf, a prince of the Geats, had killed Grendel, ended the grief, the sorrow, the suffering forced on Hrothgar's helpless people by a bloodthirsty fiend. No Dane doubted the victory, for the proof, hanging high from the rafters where Beowulf had hung it, was the monster's arm, claw, shoulder, and all. So Beowulf grabs Grendel's arm and just pulls it out. That's super intense. It says something about Beowulf's strength. I mean, anybody think they could rip a chicken leg off a live chicken? I mean, it's hard enough to get a chicken leg off a dead chicken after it's been cooked, but a live one? And imagine this giant monster, maybe 8 feet tall and enormously strong. Like, how do you rip its arm out of its socket? Could you guys even rip my arm out of my socket? Like, how many of you would take? You'd have to, tie me to a wall and put a rope around my arm and, a bunch of you pulling on it. I mean, Beowulf's a strong guy, and he rips Grendel's arm right out of his socket. He disarms him. No, couldn't help it. Sorry. But this is it. He's killed Grendel. Congratulations. Anybody else feel like this battle's a little anticlimactic? I mean, you're like, wait a second. I thought this was going to be some giant battle, and Beowulf just basically is like, I got your hand, crunch, broke your claws, crunch, ripped your arm off, problem solved. I do want to talk about that for a second. I think we've been spoiled by movies that have enormous action sequences that go on for hours and hours. That's not real life. This was written by a guy who would have experienced real combat, who would have seen what it was like. Anybody who's seen a real combat, you ever seen a school fight? Those things are over in 10 seconds. Somebody gets a snot beat out of them and it's over. And that's how it is in real life. If you're fighting with weapons or if you're fighting without weapons, the combats are always short and bloody because somebody gets wounded, and as soon as they're wounded, they can't possibly keep up anymore. And then the other guy starts beating that's how it works. And so, if you're fighting a real combat, you ever watch Olympic fencing, how quickly somebody gets a strike? That's how quickly it's done. And this is a more realistic fight in that way. So I think there's that to consider. But yeah, back to our theme here before we finish off this section. The only way that Beowulf could possibly have defeated Grendel was to defeat Grendel um, hand to hand. If he tried to use a weapon, that weapon would have been useless against him because of the magic spells that Grendel had on him. And Grendel's ability to create fear in everybody that he comes in contact with pretty much assures that they all come to him with the best weapon they can find and the best armor they can wear, which basically makes them die. So the truth is, if you go to face Grendel with any kind of fear in your heart at all, it's interesting that heart is a word that I use here because the hall is called Herat, which literally translates into heart. And so this battle takes place in the heart. Are you starting to see some allegorical implications here? I hope you are. The truth is that you can't create courage by having a weapon or an armor. Like giving a coward a gun doesn't make him brave. It just makes him a coward with a gun. So these things are not real courage. And getting drunk does not give you real courage. Getting drunk lets you do things that you're afraid to do, sure. But that's not courage. Real courage comes from the heart. It comes from within. Real courage is not making other people afraid. If people are afraid of you, that doesn't mean you're courageous. You can also be a coward. It turns out that Grendel is symbolic of fear. He causes fear in everybody around him, but it turns out that his greatest weakness is the fear that he carries around in his own heart. As soon as he finds somebody who's equal to him in some way and not afraid of him, he himself becomes fearful, just like Unferth, just like the Watchmen. The cycle continues. Beowulf is challenging you as a reader, as an Anglo-Saxon reader who wants to be a good warrior, to assess yourself. Where does your courage come from? Does your courage come from within? Is it based on who you are as a person? Or does it come from some external element? Do you get your courage by making other people scared? Do you get your courage by having the best things? Do you get your courage from, outside stimulants of some kind? And I think that's, a central question, an allegorical question. And Beowulf is saying, no, real courage comes from the heart. It comes from inside. And you can use it to defeat any demon. You can use it to defeat anything that even seems undefeatable. So I think there's this great lesson buried at the core of this combat that takes place in Herat, in the heart. But enough. I'll keep reading. Chapter 13. Why? All right. Did I skip something? Okay. And then in the morning, crowds surrounded Herat, warriors coming to that hall from faraway lands, princes and leaders of men hurrying to behold. How does this always happen to me? Thank you for bearing with me, folks. Sorry about this. Hurrying to behold the monster's great staggering tracks. They gaped with no sense of sorrow, felt no regret for his suffering, went tracing his bloody footprints, his beaten and lonely flight to the edge of the lake, where he dragged his corpse-like way, doomed and already weary of his vanishing life. The water was bloody, steaming and boiling in horrible pounding waves. Heat sucked from his magic veins. But the swirling surf had covered his death. Hidden deep in murky darkness, his miserable end, as hell opened to receive him. So Grendel went crawling through the swamp to this bubbling geyser pool and fell in and sank all the way down, and a portal to hell opened up at the bottom of it, and he sank right down into hell. And the pool is bubbling and boiling because apparently Grendel's blood is super duper hot, and it just heated the thing up to a boiling temperature, so he's got sort of hell in his veins. I think that's kind of cool. Let's see. The swirling surf had covered his death, hidden deep in the murky darkness, his miserable end, as hell opened to receive him. Then old and young rejoiced, turned back from that happy pilgrimage, mounted their hard-hoofed horses, high-spirited stallions, and rode them slowly toward Herat again, retelling Beowulf's bravery as they jogged along. And over they swore that nowhere on earth or under the spreading sky or between the seas, neither south nor north, was there a warrior worthier to rule over men. But no one meant Beowulf's praise to belittle Hrothgar, their kind and gracious king. Good. So that's it for today. We are done with the fight with Grendel. And you're like, wait a second, isn't that all that Beowulf is? It's just the fight with Grendel, right? No. It turns out that that's not the only fight in Beowulf. There's more coming. We've got more fights on deck. So stay tuned for next time, where you find out what Beowulf's next great challenge is. Thanks.